So, the history of cinema suggests a law of diminishing returns. Just look at the current state of blockbuster franchises like Jurassic Park or Star Wars or Marvel or Fast and Furious to see just like the inevitable decay in quality that creeps in like the longer a series just hangs around. Therefore, perhaps Tom Cruise's like most impossible mission of all has been to like invert that trend and like continue just to up the ante with each new thrilling installment in the Mission Impossible franchise. Can the final reckoning, the potential conclusion of the series, finish on a high note, or is the series at long last just running out of gas? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So I think, like many people, I have been a big fan of these films over the years. I think with like a world-ending scope of biblical proportions and the task of potentially serving as the finale for the series, I think Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning may be the biggest and like most ambitious entry yet. Unfortunately, I think it is also the film that may have finally found the limits of like just how far this series can be stretched, because the exhilarating stunts are still thrilling and like the action set pieces remain virtually unmatched, I think, in modern Hollywood. But like a bloated runtime, I think a jumbled plot, and like the reduction of its iconic hero to be like a virtual superhero suggests that the series may have finally run its course. Narratively, the film picks up shortly after the events of Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, which is still a mouthful of a title, I think made even more like unwieldy by the fact that the sequel elected not to adopt the Part 2 label. And with a seemingly ageless star and I think plenty of like audience goodwill, whether this is truly the end of the series remains to be seen, but it certainly plays out as both, I think, a bombastic finale and as like a retrospective celebration of the franchise. And I think in both cases, the film may be a victim of its own success. The clever like spy and like espionage roots of the series, I think, now are long gone, replaced by apocalyptic stakes that are saturated in like biblical imagery and illusions and, fantastical language about destiny and like Ethan being the chosen one. And while somewhat, I think, intriguing as like a form of cultural commentary, to me, the like AI plot remains super convoluted and I think even dull. I think too like undefined and like impersonal to be as interesting as the more like immediate and like personal stakes of prior films. And just like the sprawling cast of characters in this, including some like surprising returns, like deep cuts from the franchise, just make the story feel overstuffed at times. And as like a celebration of the series, The Final Reckoning also goes just a little bit too far and contains what I felt to be just a gratuitous number of like montage flashbacks to earlier films and like lengthy exposition dumps that attempt to draw like unnecessary connections to all the previous missions. And fans who have been like following Ethan Hunt's journey, since 1996 may appreciate like the stroll down memory lane, but the film, I think particularly the first hour of it, spends so much time kind of like reminiscing on the past that it just fails to like establish any sort of momentum in the present. Because outside of two like show-stopping action sequences and like stunts, one in the middle and then one like at the end of the film, shockingly little plot development actually happens despite a gigantic like nearly 3-hour runtime, because characters seem to spend more time just like talking about the direness of the situation and like what will happen should the mission fail, rather than just getting into motion to like act upon these sentiments. As with like the series itself, the immortal Tom Cruise may finally be starting to show like at least some signs of age, but he remains the not so secret sauce that like makes these films work. Because let's face it, Tom Cruise is still the man. And that the 62-year-old actor spends several extended scenes in this film kicking butt while essentially wearing nothing but his underwear is a major flex for his like undiminished star power. But I think he is once again great in this role, just adding a degree of like earnestness that helps sell some of the otherwise like sillier dialogue or aspects of the plot. And he may not like look much different, but Ethan Hunt has undergone some fairly drastic changes over the years, going from spy to action hero to, for all intents and purposes, a superhero. I think for better or worse, he has become more of like a physical force than an intellectual one. Because I personally like just kept waiting for the big twist that would like recontextualize the events and demonstrate that Ethan had actually been like one step ahead the entire time, but it just never comes. And instead, Ethan is repeatedly like outmaneuvered, only just to like punch his way out of trouble. And even like I think the third act climax feels somewhat uninspired in that way, because the mission involves like breaking into a vault, which is like an ongoing staple in the series, But when the heroes arrive, they find the vault abandoned and like the door left open. And once inside, rather than any sort of like obstacles for them to cleverly overcome, things quickly just devolve into yet another gunfight. And the former like espionage or like, intellectual twists and turns are exchanged for this franchise like newfound reputation for just the spectacular stunts. And I think attempting to like upstage Tom Cruise riding a motorbike off of a literal mountain in the previous film is a tall task, but this film manages once again to stage two more incredible sequences. The first occurs in like the claustrophobic confines of a submerged submarine, and the second is like an action scene set atop two soaring airplanes, and both are awesome, both from like a cinematic and just like a technical standpoint, all the more so with the knowledge that like Tom Cruise is actually performing many of those stunts. So I think like if this series has now become mostly about the spectacle and the stunts, then I think The Final Reckoning is worth the price of admission. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot. For language, I counted only just, a handful, 4 or 5, 6 of like minor profanities, but nothing beyond that. For violence, Ethan does, at least to me, seem to demonstrate a bit more like brutality than usual, particularly in one scene in which he dispatches some villains with various like axes and hammers, although the action occurs almost entirely off screen with only the violent sound effects and like the shocked facial expressions of his team member suggesting like the extent of the carnage, as well as like seeing blood covering him after the act. And then later a man's face is like slammed against a metal object which ultimately kills him and leaves like a splatter of blood behind. As far as sexuality, like I mentioned, there are several scenes that where Tom Cruise is essentially just wearing his underwear, and there's a couple other where female characters also wear outfits that reveal, some of like their midriff or some skin, but really nothing to be concerned about. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think as with Dead Reckoning Part 1, this film has plenty of very explicit like biblical references and like callbacks, because the entity, kind of, the AI force seeking to eradicate humankind, is shown to have developed like a fanatical doomsday cult who are shown in several scenes to be like quoting apocalyptic scriptures. And on like multiple occasions, Noah and the Great Flood, as described in the Bible, are referenced like in relation to the entity's efforts to destroy the earth. And even like the underground vault at the end of this film, kind of intended to be the home for the entity to like wait out and survive the global destruction, I think is fittingly referred to as an ark. And wielding like the power of the entity essentially represents the ability to play God. Therefore, like the question that has been wrestled with now for 2 films is who, if anyone, can be trusted to like wield that immense power. And like while many in the film like argue that the more prudent course of action is to use the power for good, Ethan himself desires to destroy it, but at the same time he also does demonstrate a willingness, I think, to step into that almost like godlike role. Because as characters like repeatedly point out, sort of the impossible mission of this film involves him gambling the fate of the world on the blink of an eye, whereas one character chides him, says, "For every life you try to save, you gamble millions more, and now the fate of every living soul on earth is your responsibility." I think like while Ethan seems like reluctant to give such power to any single individual, including himself, the film itself almost seems to suggest that like noble men like Ethan not only can, but arguably should be trusted with that task. And a closing like monologue voiceover, I think, further underscores this sort of like humanistic mindset, because the speech declares that like nothing is written, which is a reference to the followers of the godlike entity repeatedly saying "it is written," kind of to express the inevitability of its godlike control. And instead, the voiceover exhorts people to forge their own destiny and like be their own master. And the theme is not necessarily like explicitly anti-Christian. At least I didn't take it to like be that extreme. But I think still like within the context of the story and the way that the entity is seemingly aligned with like religious fundamentalism and like control, and just like the closing sentiment of rejecting outside influence and like forging your own personal destiny and trusting the goodness of noble men with the godlike power, does, I think, present some like worldview questions for Christians to ponder. So in the end, I remain of the opinion that like a subpar Mission Impossible film is still superior to most of the other action flicks that Hollywood seems to churn out every year. I think perhaps like watching LeBron James or some other like superstar athlete just dominate the league for decades maybe I've just become accustomed to and desensitized towards greatness, that there is a sense of like, we've seen this all before, to what probably should be more mind-blowing, like cinematic spectacle on display. And so I don't think The Final Reckoning is a bad film by any means. It's just not a particularly great one. I think even so, if this is indeed the end of the line for Ethan Hunt, then I think it is a fine send-off to what I think has been a very excellent series. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you've been a fan of this series, since the beginning, or you're just jumping on board with some of these, more recent films, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't listened to, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews. Got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast. Got interviews, just other fun stuff. We'd love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.